The yard was all breath and steel and the rasp of leather by the time the sun eased itself above the eastern wall. Frost clung stubbornly to the shadowed stones and to the iron of the racks, a glitter that the boy's boots crushed to paste. Jon worked the blunted sword with both hands, wrists loose, shoulders quiet, the way Ser Roderick had hammered into his bones with correction after correction. Robb came at him with an eager smile and a high guard, the little clatter of the wooden edges singing the same tune they had sung 1,000 mornings. Theon laughed from the fence where he perched like a cock on a rail, and Bran watched with his chin on the top bar, eyes wide and shining. "Your wind is bad," Robb said, grinning, teeth white in a face chapped by the cold. "Your wrists are worse." Jon stepped inside the arc of Robb's swing and blocked it, turned, and let the momentum run him into a quick touch at Robb's ribs to remind him of the gap. Not a blow. Ser Roderick frowned at anything showy. Touches would do. "Again," Robb said, more pleased than put out, because that was how Robb answered everything. With light and willingness, as if being beaten in one instant only meant he might get the better in the next. Ghost lay silent in the powdered frost beneath the fence. He looked at no one, watched nothing and everything with those pale eyes that held moonlight and daylight, ears pricked to each small sound. The direwolf's breath came soft and steady, blooming out in faint clouds that the morning swallowed. "Keep your feet," Ser Roderick called across the yard. "You, Robb, you step into him like a man trying to dance with a chair. Hips, gods bless us. I'm too old to teach hips to children." Again. Bran's elbows squeaked on the wood when he leaned closer. "When do I get to do that?" he asked the world at large rather than anyone in particular. "When your legs are 2 hands taller than they are, little bird," Theon said with that lazy, thick voice of his that always promised laughter and sometimes bit. He tossed a sliver of wood from palm to palm. "And when Roderick grows a second beard, you'll have your time," Jon told Bran without taking his eyes from Robb's shoulders. That was where a boy who hadn't yet learned to lie with his body told the truth. Shoulders tensed for a cut, hips for a step. "There's no hurry." Bran huffed and relayed the huff down the fence like he'd pushed it along for someone else to catch. "There is." Robb slipped to Jon's left, quick, and tried a thrust that would have done for someone taller. Jon turned it aside and saw the delight flash in Robb's eyes all the same, because a try is its own coin. They pressed and broke, pressed and broke. Their breath made its own veil, and behind it the yard went about its morning. Men-at-arms checking buckles and laces, boys fetching water, smoke from the kitchens already thickening to the particular smell of Winterfell's mornings. Fat and flour and wood smoke, a smell that lived inside your clothes whether you wanted it to or not. Far above, a raven croaked. Then another. A third-winged silhouette drifted from the rookery and cut across the pale sky toward the great keep. Ser Roderick saw it, or else he'd been waiting for it. He turned, the wool of his collar scratching his cheek, and his eyes went to the Muse. "Enough," he said, not loudly but in a way that went to the bone. "Enough." Robb stepped back, lowering his practiced sword, chest rising and falling. "What is it?" Ser Roderick didn't answer at once. His fingers went to his mustache, smoothing a habit into it, and something in the line of his shoulders went still. "Maester Luwin will know," he said, and that meant not to ask further. The man in the hood by the well clicked the bucket back into place and stood looking as if that might tell him anything at all. Theon slid off the fence. "The birds have more gossip than I do," he said, vexed at the world's audacity. "It isn't right." "Nothing is," Jon said, with more humor than truth. He watched the arc of the raven's wings as it made the turn around the ridgepole. It was a small thing to see and a smaller thing to know that someone far off had tied a strip of the world to its leg. He felt the tug of that strip all the same. His breath fogged and disappeared. Ghost's head came up as if some sound finer than air had called to him. He stood without a shake, without gathering himself, as if he had not been still but coiled. Jon reached automatically for the thick ruff behind his ears, fingers disappearing into fur that was warm in the cold. The white wolf's ears flicked once and then stilled. He did not lean into the touch. He never did. That was how Jon knew he belonged to the animal as much as the other way around. Again tomorrow, Robb said, and tapped Jon's practice sword with his own in ritual. And I'll remember my wrists, old man. You remember them, and I'll remember your feet, Jon answered. Bran's face wrinkled like a folded cloth. I'll remember both, he said, stubborn. And then Ser Rodrik will have to grow a third beard. It was harder to laugh than it should have been. Jon laughed anyway because Bran's certainty deserved it. They broke apart. Robb went to change into something that didn't smell like sweat and ash. Bran trotted after him, still talking. Theon wandered toward the kitchens on the scent of cooked oats and fruit, muttering this and that to whatever shadows chose to listen. Ser Rodrik conferred with 2 men-at-arms in voices pitched low. Jon wiped the wood sweat from his hands and leaned his forehead for a moment against the fence's cold top rail. It was good to press himself to Winterfell like that when the day threatened to run too fast. The stone answered with its own slow, patient heat, sunk deep and steady from fires that had burned before he was born and would burn after he died, and that steadiness always found him. Ghost leaned into his thigh. Jon's hand dropped to the fur again. Wolf's heart raced its quiet, tireless rhythm against his palm. The thick of him hid the muscle, but it was there all the same, heat and breath and a pulse that remembered hills no man had named and the hunt no man had watched. A boy in livery came running, boots scuffing frost, hat in hand. He looked toward Jon and then away as if he could not decide whether to meet his eyes. "Jon," he said, dropping the courtesy because it had not been taught for him to use on bastards. "Maester Luwin is looking for you. He wants you in the Great Keep. He said to come quick." "Did he?" Jon asked. The boy couldn't say anything else useful. It would be in his shoulders if he tried. "All right." He hung the practice sword on its hook and set the leather strap back into its neat coil. He took up his gloves and tucked them beneath his belt because he had never liked the feel of cloth on his hands when the day was still being decided. Ghost paced at his side like a shadow some god had forgot to color. They crossed the yard. On the stair, Catelyn came down with her skirt gathered in one hand as if it might be the tail of some careful animal. Her hair was pinned with pale wooden combs. She saw him and saw through him the way she always did, the way a woman might see a cracked window and then choose the one beside it. There was no cruelty in what she did. There was nothing so keen. She took him in and made him nothing with the same steadiness with which she did everything. He stepped aside and bowed. She passed with a nod that bent the minimum amount a neck can bend and still be counted a nod. Ghost's ears twitched backward. The wolf did not growl. Jon had learned to be grateful for that much. He found Maester Luwin in the solar with his fingers stained by whatever ink he had been mixing and the gray chain heavier on his chest than it had been yesterday. The Maester's eyes had the distance in them that meant he had read something whose words wanted to be more than they were. That had a way of happening with ink. "There you are," Luwin said, and the relief in the words was a small, warm thing. "Your Lord Father will want you in the Godswood. He asked for you himself." Jon thought, absurdly, that his heart had forgotten how to go on. Ghost leaned against his knee hard enough that it might have made him stumble if his legs hadn't chosen for him. "Now?" He had not meant to say the word. Came out whispering. "Now?" Luwin's smile was a careful line drawn with a quill over thin parchment. He reached for a cloth to wipe his hands and made his chain clink like rain on a shutter. "I expect he is already waiting. Go, boy." "Is it about the raven?" Jon asked, trying to sound as if it did not matter and failing, because Luwin was Luwin and could read you the way he read a ledger, line by line. Luwin looked at his fingers and the smudges there that would never quite come out. There are matters a raven brings and matters a man carries with him for long years. It might be that both have arrived together. Go on. The corridors were cool and held the smell of baked clay and old rushes. The breath of Winterfell laid down in layers. Women bent over baskets by the hearth in the great hall, stringing beans and arguing softly in the way kin do when they have argued their whole lives and will argue them entire. The doors of the hall stood open. The sky beyond was very thin and very blue and meant nothing. He cut across the courtyard where the well stood like a fat man with his throat cut, mouth open to the cold, past the kennels. No sound from within but a shifting of straw and a huff that answered ghost with its own smell. Past the old broken tower with its stones exploded outward as if a giant's hand had reached into the heart of it and crushed. He took the covered walk to the kitchens. The heat that rolled from there threw a gloss on his face and made the thin hairs on his arms try to lift. He didn't pause. The door to the godswood was a full hand of iron and oak that swung on a hinge so thick a man could not close his fingers around it. He opened it and stepped out into air that had kept the night. The godswood of Winterfell was older than the keep, older than the wall that held the trees, older than the stones men thought were old. It breathed differently. The world came at you slow here. The small paths wound in on themselves until where you ended up was where you hadn't meant to be. The leaves wore frost like a garment instead of a wound. The heart tree waited at the center with its pale bark and its red carved face leaking sap like tears. It was beautiful and ridiculous and frightening all at once, the way truth is sometimes. His father stood beneath the boughs with his hands behind his back. He did not lean on the sword that was thrust point down into the earth beside him, because Eddard Stark did not lean on anything anyone could see. He looked smaller than he looked in the hall and larger. There were days Jon thought his father was two men and could not decide which one he belonged to. Ned turned when he heard footsteps that were careful of the little branches jutting from the path and saw his son as if he had been carving his face in his mind and now did the checking. His mouth bent into something that was not a smile and not the opposite of one. "Jon," he said. Ghost went to the little pool to the left of the tree and set his nose just above the water as if he were testing who had drunk there last year. The wolf's reflection was as white as anything in the godswood ever was. Jon stopped 3 paces from his father and felt every one of them as if each were its own problem. "You sent for me," he said, and then remembered how a voice should say such a thing and put his shoulders the way a son's shoulders should be. "I did." Ned looked at the heart tree and then down at the ground, as if the face mattered and the dirt mattered and the boy between did not, which was not true, but might be easier. "This is a poor place for much, but the only place for some." Jon waited. That was the lesson he had learned first. Wait, and sometimes the thing will tell you what it is of its own accord. Ned's hand went to the pommel of the sword as if to count the grooves there, and then left it. "A message has come to Winterfell from the south," he said. "The words on the strip are not beyond guessing. King Robert will come north. In a week, perhaps more, perhaps fewer. He brings the queen and his sons and his brothers. He means to sit beneath my roof, and when a king sits under your roof, the roof must be sound around him." Jon had thought to feel something at that, panic or excitement or the childish pleasure of seeing a thing bigger than you. Instead, he felt the godswood's cold find its way under his shirt to the skin of his back. "We will have to kill 1,000 boars," he said, because he had to say something, and that came to him like a rope thrown into deep water. Ned breathed out, slow. That breath turned to nothing in the air and then to nothing even smaller. 100 will do." He was silent, and the silence set its weight down evenly across them both, the way a blanket does in a cold room. When he looked at Jon again, his eyes had gone somewhere else for a moment and had returned with the thing they had fetched. "I had thought to never speak the words I am about to speak," he said. "That was my promise to the dead and my shield for the living. It seems I cannot keep them both. Promise and shield. A man with 2 hands can hold 2 things only so long. Then one falls, and he must choose which he will pick up and which he will leave to the floor." Jon's heart, which had stalled near the solar, began to find something like speed. He felt Ghost lift his head by the pool as if the sound of the water had changed. "Father," he said, and the word caught on the barb of itself. Ned's mouth tightened the way leather tightens in the sun. "You have called me that since the first day you had words. I have been it to you in every way I knew how. I loved you. I love you as if you were a son I had sired. You must hear me while I say that. Do you hear me? I hear you." Jon's pulse was a thread at his throat that some hand he could not see had taken between finger and thumb. "There are truths that are not safe in daylight. I did not tell you because in the telling I could not keep you. Men die for less than the truth, and boys are no different." Ned looked at the heart tree again. Its red eyes were no comfort to him. they never had been. He had prayed here 1,000 times and had never felt the gods do anything but listen without pity. Your mother was my sister Lyanna. Jon had thought he was ready for any direction the words might go. He had thought that, and the thought was a fool. His mouth couldn't decide what to be. He made it say the word. My mother. Ned nodded, one short nod like the blow a hammer gives when it knows the nail is set. Your father was Prince Rhaegar Targaryen. There was a sound in the godswood that had not been there a moment before. No, it had, and only now did it arrive at him. The slow drip from a leaf that had caught last night's melt and held it until a breath had moved it loose. The drop fell. Jon heard the falling as if it were every falling thing that had ever fallen. He closed his eyes, and the world came closer for being shut out. He could see Robb's grin and Ser Roderick's frown and Bran's stubborn chin and Arya's quick hands moving even when they were supposed to be still. He could see Theon's crooked smiles, and Sansa's hair lifted by some harmless breeze. He could see Catelyn's cool nod that had never been more than a nod. He could see his own hands, scabbed across the knuckles for a week from a misjudgment with a shield rim. He opened his eyes. The heart tree looked back with its ridiculous, terrible face. I swore an oath, Ned said, and now the words came as if they had waited behind his teeth and had only ever been waiting. I swore to your mother. This I will keep as long as I can keep anything. I took you from the place where she died and brought you here and named you mine to live. Robert Baratheon would have killed you without looking. He would have cut a child from his mother's breast and called it justice for his own grief. I would not give him that gift. So I made you my bastard and let the world take its small comforts where it could find them. Jon had not moved, but he discovered he had taken a step. The ground understood him better than he did. He could not make the next word. Came anyway from somewhere near the bottom of him. Why tell me? Ned's mouth bent again into that shape that could not decide what it meant to be. The king is coming. He will make me his hand if I do not pull down Winterfell stones on my own head. He will drag me south where men remember names differently. In the south there are more ears than faces and they belong to no one. The secret you are is a small boat on a big sea. I have kept you hidden under the lee of this wall. When I go, the wall goes with me. I could go with you, Jon said, ridiculous as a boy offering to hold up the sky. You could not. There was anger there, but it was only what grief sometimes wears when it goes out to buy salt. And I would not let you. There are too many eyes in King's Landing. There are men who would see you for what you are because they have wanted to see it for years. Before the sun and the moon and all the men in the realm, I will not give you to them. Jon did not know he had turned until he was facing the heart tree with his back to his father. He looked at the carved face until it became nothing but cuts in wood and red sap filling them. What am I? He asked, and hated how the words sounded when they left him. A child's question. You are my sister's son, Ned said. You are your mother's, and I will not have any man speak of her with anything but respect wit. In my hearing, she loved you. She gave you her last breath, and that will be enough for me if it is never enough for anyone else. And you are Prince Rhaegar's. There is dragon blood in you, whether it brings you joy or sorrow. I had thought to spare you both. There is no sparing some things. Ghost paced to him and set his head against Jon's thigh in the way he did when a horse shied. The white fur took the bruise of Jon's fingers and gave no sign of it, only heat back and solidity. Jon's mouth had gone dry in the way snow does when you try to eat it and all it does is make you colder inside. He tried to think of Rhaegar as anything more than a name men swore by or swore at. He knew the stories. There was a song for every sin and a sin for every song. He tried to put his own face beside the ghost of the princes. The face shifted and would not hold still. He tried to think of Lyanna as more than the stone and the winter roses that grew where no roses should grow. She had been a girl and then a woman and had ridden like the wind and had laughed loudly enough to make men look up. He had never heard her laugh. He had never heard her speak. He had the shape of other people's memories of her, and that was not the same thing. What do you want me to do? He asked. Breathe, Ned said softly. Stand still in yourself until the ground stops tilting. After that, we will decide what comes next. He looked at the trees as if he might find a list written down the side of one. For now you will tell no one. Not Luwin. Not Rob. Not anyone. Secrets told in love leave the mouth on their own feet and go where they please. Jon swallowed. The swallow hurt. He put his hand against Ghost's skull, just to remind his fingers of the world. When you go south, he said. When I go south, you will remain. Ned said it the way men say a thing they have decided and will not undecide. There is the wall. There is the watch. I had thought. In truth, I had thought to take you there myself this winter and set your hand in your uncle's and make of it something you could hold on to. That was my plan, and I confess its selfishness. It would have set my mind at a kind of ease. A vow makes some things simple, but perhaps it would have been an ease you did not need. Perhaps it will still be. We will see. You would set a prince to a black cloak? The words came out of him before he could stop them and burned his tongue for their pride. He heard them and he was ashamed, and something else that was not shame at all. Ned's head turned, slowly, like a man listening to a far bell. I would set my sister's son where he could be himself without any other man's permission. I would set a boy I love where oaths and snow and old stones will keep him safer than courtiers and silk. I would set you where your blood means less than your hand and your word, if any place can be such a place. I do not know if the wall is that place. I have never been a black brother, but I know the South is not it. The pool made its small sound again. Jon's heart found it, and for a moment the two were the same rhythm. He nodded, a little because his neck could not bear a big nod. I won't tell anyone, he said. The promise hooked itself into him. He felt it take. Come to me after supper, Ned said. If you wish, we will talk. I will. The words had shape only because he gave them shape. Ned looked at him for a long moment in which Jon found nothing he could use and much that he did not want. Then the Lord of Winterfell turned away, drew his sword out of the earth, and stood for a heartbeat looking at the dirt that clung to the steel as if something about the stain required respect. He wiped it clean with a square of cloth from his belt as he had done 10,000 times and took his leave without more. There were things Ned Stark did not know how to say, and Jon had always had to make his peace with that. When he was alone with Ghost and the tree, Jon moved to the stone bench beneath the boughs and sat. The stone held the cold and gave it back. He held it in turn because a man must hold what is given to him until he can do something else with it. Ghost's weight settled against his shin. He put his hand in the wolf's thick ruff and did not think of anything but breath until thinking did not feel like walking on a deck in a storm. He had known himself all his life to be a small thing made to fit the corners and the quiets. Bastard. The word had not stung in years. It had not needed to. It had lain across him like a blanket that was thin but serviceable. It had let him move through the hall without being asked to sit or to test the weight of words against him. It had taught him where to put his hands at feasts and how far to look away when men spoke of their sons, because sometimes their pride needed room like a man needs room for his elbows. In that shape he had found himself. His fists, his back, Ghost's shoulder against his thigh when the world asked for more than it had any right to ask for. He had thought that was the whole of it. The blanket had been scratchy, but it had been his. Now the blanket had slid off and he sat naked under a sky that was no sky he had seen. There was no one to tell him whether to pull the thing back up or get to his feet and let the wind do what it wanted. Ghost lifted his head and whined. The small sound he only made for Jon in the darkest part of the night when he was dreaming, and it was bad. Jon's hand went to him again, grateful for the asking. All right, he said, though the words were for himself as much as the wolf. All right. He did not know how long he sat. He knew the sun crawled higher and made long needles of light through the tree boughs, and the frost burned itself down to damp where it lay in the path. He knew that somewhere a bell announcing the midday meal clanged without grace and stopped. He knew he would have to stand at some point and be the boy Winterfell knew how to look at. He got up. When he had to, Ghost paced him out of the godswood, and the change from air that had grown in a sacred place to air that had grown over boiled meats and dog breath made Jon's stomach think of food without asking him. The hall was crowded in the way halls are when there is news. He knew it before he stepped across the threshold. The hum was different. Men wore their arms even when their arms were eating. Servants smiled even at the men they did not like. You could tell a thing by the way it rode other things. He kept his pace even, his shoulders square, and took a seat near the bottom of the table that made room for itself with the quiet that belongs to boys who know where they belong. He folded his hands and waited for a trencher. Ghost lay beneath it and breathed in the old meat slick, nostrils barely flaring. Robb tumbled into the place beside him as if a wind had thrown him there. "The king," he said, as if the word were as tasty as the bread he had torn in half. "Gods, Jon. The king is coming to Winterfell." "So I hear," Jon said. His voice was the voice he wore when he did not want to trouble anyone with anything. He wished it had a different face. It wore his all the same. Robb tore the bread into two brutal halves and pressed one into Jon's hand without looking, the way he always had. "It'll be a sight. The whole of it, and the banners and the noise. Have you ever seen—" "No, of course you haven't. Nor I. We're what, 8 days from a thing we can't guess. Gods. I mean," he laughed, a spill of sound. "My father says not to act like a fool. I've been trying all morning to learn how." "Let me know when you do," Jon said, and Robb knocked their shoulders together. Sansa sat farther up, near her mother, back very straight, hair caught in a net that made it look like something precious someone had set aside. She smiled when she caught Robb's eye and did not smile when she caught Jon's, because she had never learned, had perhaps never been taught, that a smile costs a girl nothing. Arya had slipped away from Septa Mordane's flock like a little fish through weeds and appeared now in a place she had not been put, kneeling on the bench and dipping her finger in the broth to taste it with defiant pleasure. When she saw Jon, she gave him a smile that was nothing like Sansa's. It was all teeth and affection and perhaps a dare. He felt it touch somewhere under his ribs. He made a small motion with his hand, 2 fingers, the sign they had shared when they were smaller for later. Her eyes lit as if he'd given her a present. "Your wolf is under my seat," Theon announced to no one in particular, pushing at Ghost with the heel of his boot, which Ghost accepted as if the leather were a leaf. He grinned down the table as if he had made something happen. "Save a bite for him or he'll remember me wrong." "He remembers you exactly," Jon said, and that got a laugh from the table for no reason he could see. The sound passed over him. It did no harm. Catelyn's eyes slid to him and away again, little dark birds that could not be persuaded to land. Ned sat in his place at the high table and ate what was put before him without much tasting, eyes going to the door as if it would open and bring him something he'd been waiting to see for years and had not seen. Maester Luwin murmured something to him that made his head tilt a fraction and his lips press together, as if whatever sense the Maester had offered him had satisfied no itch. After the meal, Jon slipped away. He knew which rushes would hold and which would slide under your heel and cast you on your back. He had learned that, too. He found a corner of the yard that held the sun, as if it were a small animal men had forgotten, and leaned his shoulders against the wall there until the stone began to share its stolen heat. Theon passed, practicing a whistle, and tossed him a look as if he'd expected to find him exactly there. He went on without comment. Jon breathed, measured, and pushed the day back where it belonged in front of him. He found Arya at the small archery range that had been set aside for the girls because no one had the heart to tell his lordship's youngest daughter she could not have a bow, but also no one had the courage to suffer his lady wife's eyes if they set her with the boys. A compromise, then, like all things in Winterfell that had to do with Arya and swords. Her arrow had found bark twice and dirt 3 times. The target stood unmarked as a new day. She scowled down the shaft of another for so long that the arrow began to sag under its own small weight. "You're choking it," Jon said. "I am not," Arya said, and then glanced at him sidelong and relaxed her fingers a little, because she was not so proud she would let stubbornness keep her from hitting something. "Sansa says I'll never be good at this." "Sansa says many things," Jon said, and picked up the spare bow because the look she gave him asked for a demonstration so nakedly it would have been cruelty not to oblige. He set an arrow, breathed to the bottom of his lungs, and let the string kiss his fingers on the way out. The arrow found the very edge of the painted ring with a satisfying thump. "I'm not good at much else," he said lightly. "You'll be better." Arya made a face as if she could not decide whether to be pleased or angry. She let her own arrow fly and it hit just under his. She whooped, "Did you see that?" "I did." He had to smile because there it was. Simple joy. The world would beat it out of her in 1,000 little ways, and still she'd find it. He loved her for that. She glanced around and, seeing no one who would frown, scrambled up onto the wall and sat with her legs swinging, her boots knocking the stone as if she were telling it a secret. She leaned down toward him. What did father want in the gods would? Jon set the bow down and considered all the things he could not say. He set his face into a shape he could maintain. Arya saw more than most, but she was still a child, even if she hated the word more than any other. "Men and their talk," he said. "He says the king is coming." The king. The word did not sit in her mouth the way it had sat in Robb's. She turned it over and looked at the underside. "Do you think he'll let me see his sword?" Jon laughed despite himself. "He will be too busy letting everyone else see it." "I want to see it more than everyone," she said, stuck her tongue out at the imagined everyone, and then looked at him again. The light went soft in her eyes in that way he never saw on her and always saw on Robb. "You look like you did when I spilled honey on your shirt and told you about it a day later when it had already had its revenge." "Do I?" He put his fingers in Ghost's ruff for the 100th time that day. "You do," she said. "If you were anyone else, I'd ask if you were going to cry." "If I cried," Jon said, "would you go away?" "No," Arya said, and her tone told him exactly how little she cared for the word pride. "I'd sit and watch because when have I ever seen you cry?" He looked at the stones of the yard so he wouldn't look at her. "I'll tell you a thing," he said quietly, because his father's command still lit his blood, "but there are some roads you can walk along without stepping off them. Something has changed. I won't tell you what. I will tell you it's mine and I am keeping it. Do you understand?" She made a face and did not understand, and then decided that lack of understanding was an insult to them both. "Then I'll keep it with you," she said stubbornly, "even if I don't know what it is." He nodded because you had to reward a bravery like that even when it was useless. "Thank you." They sat in the late afternoon like that. A boy and a girl and a white wolf and a secret that had begun to grow teeth. Shadows lengthened and the air took on the thinness that presages evening, like a cloth being pulled between two hands. Somewhere Bran shouted, a high sound of delight followed by the particular crash of a smaller boy tumbling and discovering that the world is made of resistance. Theon yelled from across the yard something about not climbing that, and if you climb it, do not fall from it, and if you fall from it, fall where I can see you. The old tower leaned its ruin into the sky and did not move. Jon could feel Winterfell breathe around him, and under that the slower heartbeat of the world. He did not go to the crypts because that would have been melodrama, and he had never had the energy for melodrama, though later he would wonder if perhaps he should have. He went after supper to his father, as he had said he would, and listened to voices he had heard before when men talked of South and duty and old friendship and grudges that had survived longer than their reasons. Ned did not say the names that made the secret true again. Jon did not ask. They spoke instead of horses and of pack trains and of whether Robb's shoulders would take a full mail shirt without making him a danger to himself. In between, they did not say the thing they both held in their mouths like a fishbone. It made for a strange kind of comfort. He did go to the crypts the next morning, before the sun had warmed the stones enough to cast their smell back up. He went without telling anyone he went and took a candle because he was not so proud he would pretend the dark was not its own country. Ghost's claws clicked softly on the steps. The dark came up to meet them like a cat. The rows of Starks watched him with the blank attention of people who had listened too long to the same story. He passed faces he knew by name and faces he knew only by the stories men told of them. At last he came to the statue of Lyanna, the winter roses carved at her feet with more skill than the world had had any right to have at the moment they were set. Someone, who, had set there a little knot of dried flowers wrapped with a blue ribbon so faded it was barely a ribbon. He stood and looked at the stone until the idea of a girl did not shift under the idea of a woman. It took longer than he admitted to himself. He held his candle until the wax licked his knuckles and then set it down in a niche, a small light that would be gone before any man who loved it could miss it. Ghost sat and watched him. The wolf cocked his head as if aware that Jon was trying to speak to stone and could not make his mouth do it. He did not whine this time. There was something proper about it all, and Ghost knew propriety when he found it. "I won't be what you were," Jon said to the air, to the stone, to the wax. He had not meant to say anything, and the words came out without his leave. "I don't know what I'll be, but it won't be that." The crypts did not answer. They were polite like that. The days that followed braided themselves into a rope made of small work and larger preparations. The women of the keep washed and mended and cursed with a kind of joy that meant they were building something they could be proud of. The men made the stables ready, rubbing oil into leather that creaked like a tired body stretching. Roderick drilled the guard until their feet made the yard sound like a drum. Children were given tasks that would keep them out from underfoot, and since most tasks in Winterfell already existed to do that, it was easy. Jon moved through it all like a thread through cloth. He did what he was told and watched the corners for the places the secret might slip out if he did not mind it. He did not let his gaze go to his father too long, because a man pays attention to what others watch. He avoided Catelyn because he always had, and now there was something else layered under the old reason. He played at the edges with Robb and laughed at Theon's bad jokes and let Arya steal an apple off a plate and pretend he hadn't seen. One evening, the watchman on the outer wall lit a fire that was not for warming. The flame leapt out of the brazier and sent the old smoke mes. Sage that had gone between keeps for as long as men had kept them. Someone answered it to the south with their own flame. A rush moved through Winterfell that had nothing to do with wind. The next morning, Benjen Stark arrived from the wall with 4 men in black behind him and the smell of the cold that never leaves that place clinging to him like a second shirt. He dismounted and snorted in the same breath, as if he had not yet decided if he were pleased to be here. He clasped his brother in the courtyard, and for a moment they both forgot to be men and were simply boys with their arms around one another and their foreheads pressed together. And then they remembered. Benjen thumped Jon's shoulder with a gloved fist and squinted at him, as if trying to decide how much taller he had gotten since the last time they had played at snow behind the kitchens. Ghost sniffed Benjen's boots and then turned his head away the way a cat does when it has decided you are not presently interesting. "Your uncle says you spar like a boy too eager for glory," Benjen told him that night by the kitchen fire, when they had found a corner that Theon's laughter had not spilled into and the servants left them alone because Benjen had an air that made servants do that. "Don't let him say you eat like one too, or I'll drag you by your ear to the wall and put you to the geese." "I don't eat like a boy who doesn't know how soon supper will happen again," Jon said. "I eat like a boy who has a wolf." Benjen's mouth quirked. "That you do." He drank from the cup he had not yet decided whether to praise or curse. "Is your mind still set?" Jon knew what he meant without asking. He did not have to put his secret anywhere near this. That was relief and something like sorrow. "I would take the black," he said, "if my lord father would have it. If my lady would allow it." Benjen's mouth did the bend again. "Your lady has no say in it and too much say in it, both at once." He set his cup down and watched the small steam rise and vanish as if it could tell him what a boy should do. "You're young." "I'm not so young," Jon said, and heard the pride and had no time to regret it. "You are," Benjen said, with the certainty of a man who has watched seasons too long to be argued with. "But they'll take you. They always need men. If you belong anywhere, you'll know when you get there. That's as good a rule as any." Jon thought of the heart tree. He thought of the white dunes of snow that gathered against the high walls of the old fortresses and the sound men made when they moved through it, the small chafe of wool and the metal's edge and the silence where there should have been birds. "I don't know where I belong," he said. He had not meant to crawl close to the secret, but there he was, fingers in its fur. Benjen's eyes flicked to him and away. "Most men don't," he said. "The trouble is not in the not knowing. It's in trying to settle into something that doesn't fit. Makes a sore that never heals." He rapped his knuckles softly on the table, as if he were knocking on a door without wanting anyone to open it. "There's a weight to the wall. We'll see if it sits well on your back." "I'll have to see if I can stand under it," Jon said, and that was more true than Benjen knew. His uncle took the words and turned them over like something carved out of bone. When the news came that the royal train had passed the last milepost and would be within sight by noon the next day, Winterfell put on the face it wore for strangers. Boys were scrubbed until their ears glowed. Girls were pinned and polished and told to keep their mouths still. Banners that had slept in cedar chests awoke and breathed. Men checked the iron on their boots as if taking communion. Jon sharpened the knives that had needed it and brought up more benches from the store, and then he took himself to the walkway along the inner curtain and looked out across the world that was coming. The land lay like a sleeping animal, stubble brown and frost pale. Humps of brush and the line of the road a scar the snow could not quite erase. Ghost put his forepaws up on the knee-high Merlin and placed his chin there, ears forward but not too much so. The wolf's breath smoked and then blew away. They stood like that for a time. If a man had looked up, he might have said he had seen a white flag on the battlement. The thought made Jon's mouth twitch. Robb found him there in the thin, blue cold that came before dusk. His hair was wind-tangled, and he carried his own excitement so openly Jon wanted to put a cloak over him so the night wouldn't snatch it away. "We'll ride out to meet them," Robb said without preamble. "Father says with honor, but not too far. He says a king likes to make his own parade, and who am I to argue? Do you think he'll remember me?" "You were too," Jon said. "He might remember your father put you on his knee and you stole his knife." Robb's mouth fell open. "You're making that up." "I am," Jon said, and Robb shoved him with his shoulder. Ghost made a soft sound that was not a warning and not a warning, and Robb's hand automatically found the place behind the wolf's ear that liked to be scratched. It was a trick Jon had taught him. "This is a place that does not mind. Come with us," Robb said suddenly, fiercely. "We'll go together. I mean, you will anyway. Won't you?" Jon swallowed once. He could have said no easily and saved Robb from a small embarrassment in front of men who counted. He could have said yes to make Robb shine more. He said neither. "I'll be where I should be," he said, and felt the old smallness lie back down across him even as the new largeness stood to stretch its crude limbs. Robb nodded because he always had a little room in him for things he didn't understand. "I'll look for you," he said. "You won't need to," Jon said. "I'll see you." He dreamed that night that he stood on a stair that had no end in either direction, and that men he had never met passed him by and each of them set a hand on his shoulder as they went. And some hands were kind and some were indifferent, and none of them meant what they could have meant if they had belonged to one man. He woke before dawn with the taste of iron in his mouth and the sound of Ghost's breath steady and near. He lay on his back and counted the beams in the ceiling and pretended the counting had some ritual to it that might bind him to the life he had known. When that did not work, he rose and dressed in wool that had been mended 3 times and went out into air that had not decided yet what it would be. He ate without tasting and put one foot before the other because men did, and he had always been good at doing what men did. By mid-morning, the outermost watchman's horn blew the long note that meant sighted and then the short one that meant certain. And then the yard turned itself inside out and back again. Horses were led from stalls to hands to harness. Men hoisted standard poles. Women smoothed their skirts one last time and told one another not to fuss. Sansa's hair shone like something you could eat. Arya had ink on her hand from trying to hide it under her sleeve and left a fingerprint on her own cheek without noticing. Catelyn stood with a look on her face that was not pride and not fear and not welcome and had something of all three. Ned took his place where he was meant to take it, and when he stood there the place looked as if it had been built for him. "Don't forget to bow," Theon whispered to Jon as he passed, and then grinned because he had made a joke and didn't care if it wasn't one. Jon took up his station near the back of the hall's doors with the other boys who did not belong anywhere more particular, the game-pole leaners and the lads who carried messages and the sons of men important enough to be allowed inside and not important enough to be seen doing more than that. Ghost lay at his feet and put his head on his paws, eyes open. Jon breathed and felt the breath go in and come out and imagined the road beyond the walls and the dust of the train and the great weight of it like a thing pushing the ground down as it moved. He thought of words he had learned these last days that he had never needed before. Prince, father, name. They did not yet know where to be in his mouth. He did not yet know where to be in the world. He kept still as the keep learned how to make room for a king within its stones. The horns on the outer wall blew again, shorter now, closer, voices reaching the courtyard like birds arriving before the flock. In the torchlit dusk of the hall, the banners stirred in a draft. Jon set his hand lightly on Ghost's neck and let that one warm, certain thing stand for every uncertain thing that would come after. He watched the door and waited, and the waiting felt like a cliff between what had been and what would be. He had a moment's foolish wish to hold on to both, and then the wish went away, because the door was opening and whatever came through it, he would have to let it come. The doors worked open as if the stone itself had learned courtesy, and light from the yard spilled in a pale sheet that narrowed around the shapes that filled it. Men entered first, the forerunners, boots marking the stone in a rhythm Winterfell had not heard in years. After them came the black line of the king's spears, and behind the spears the banners that put their colored tongues into the hall's breath. The crowned stag of Baratheon heavy on black silk, the crimson lion of Lannister that always looked as if it were moving even when cloth hung still. The smell that came with them was not Winterfell's smell, the old comfort of tallow and smoke and boiled oats, but horses and road dust and the faint wine sweet of spilled casks. Robert came like a tide, a man built as much of appetite as of bone. He had grown broader than the songs, thick about the middle where feasts had taken root, but the set of his shoulders still spoke a language that had not forgotten weight. His beard was black shot through with winter, his hair a tousled crown in truth if not in law. He laughed as he crossed the threshold, a sound so ready it made silence feel as if it had been sulking. He flung his arms wide as if he meant to gather the whole hall in and squeeze until every last drop of doubt came out. "Ned," he said, and the name was a homecoming all its own even before the men touched. They came together with the clapping thud of two oaks leaning in the same wind. The years fell off them like old bark that had been waiting to give way. Eddard bowed his head into the other man's shoulder for a single heartbeat that went longer than a breath and shorter than a memory, then stepped back. "Your Grace," he said as duty demanded, and his mouth could not quite keep the straight line it aimed for. "Winterfell welcomes you." "Winterfell feeds me," Robert returned, and gripped Ned's forearm as if to test whether it were still the same arm he had leaned on years ago. "And warms me, gods keep it. I've ridden a world of cold to get to your fire." Queen Cersei entered as if the hall had been built for her to pass through it. She was a different kind of fire, wine-bright and set in worked gold. Her hair was the color of summer barley when the sun is low. Her mouth had learned to make smiles that did not necessarily belong to what she felt. She took the place beside her husband as if she had always been there and would be there when the rest of them had been ground to gravel. Jaime Lannister, the mirror of her, walked in his glossy ease. A man who could have lifted a blade and drawn light with it for an hour just for the pleasure of seeing it move. The hound's burned face followed, a sneer carved once and then left to age. The king's guard fanned like white gulls behind them, pale cloaks on their shoulders, some clean, some already ringed with travel dirt. The royal children see. Aim in a small wave after the great one. Joffrey made himself taller by how he walked and by the tilt of his chin. He was a boy made of gold. Hair that shade that always made men look twice. A fine-boned face that would draw eyes even if it did not want them, which it did. Tommen came round and open, his hand fighting not to reach for his sisters and losing from time to time. Myrcella slipped through her brothers like a fish in clear water, her smile genuine for anyone who happened to catch it and small when the catching grew greedy. Behind and about them their servants and the queen's ladies made their cloud of whisper. At Jon's feet Ghost let out one soft breath that stirred the hair around his muzzle and then was still. Jon could feel the floor through the thin leather of his shoes, the particular shiver stone had in it when too many boots moved at once. He watched Robert clasp Maester Luwin's hands and clap Ser Roderick on the shoulder, as if the older man were an old hound that required both respect and a firm touch. He watched the queen's eyes flicker like a woman taking inventory. She measured tapestries and faces and distances to doorways with the same attention. The hall paid attention back in the way stone pays attention, by holding the sound and shape of everything that crosses it and refusing to be altered by any of it. Introductions made their slow net. Names and titles were offered as if to a ledger. Catelyn's bow was deep and exact, and the queen's smile matched it in measure and in nothing else. Sansa's curtsy put a delighted light into the eyes of at least 3 of the queen's ladies. Arya's curtsy made one of those same women look away, and Jon loved his sister for it from a safe distance that would not cost her a scolding now. Robb took his place near his father and looked directly at the king, as if the force of his looking might make him remembered. Robert took him in and barked a laugh that warmed the air a hand and a half. "The boy who pissed on my boot before I went to bleed for his father," he said, and the hall laughed because the king had laughed. Robb laughed too because there was nothing else he could do and because he was Robb. His ears went pink. Jon watched it all with the steadiness he had learned to wear. He let his eyes slide past the queen to the knight in white with sunlight caught in his hair, to the short man at the back of the train who moved with the loose assurance of someone who had never found a chair that quite fit him and had taught himself to sit comfortably in all of them. Tyrion Lannister's gaze made a small circuit of the hall and then skipped, clever and quick, over Jon as if Jon were a puzzle that would still be there when he had time for it. The hound glanced down at Ghost and Ghost's ears notched back for a beat, not from fear. Jon had never seen fear in the wolf, but from the assessment of another predator who wore a man's smell like an ill-fitting cloak. The hound's burned side did not move at all. The good half of his face sneered by habit and stopped before it became anything like a smile. Ned took the king to be fed and warmed, and the hall flexed to admit the train and its small universe. Jon and the other boys on the edge were pulled into the work like bits of straw catching at a broom. Theon found a place at a shoulder he did not belong to and made himself belong by grinning, as if smiles were currency and he had pockets full of them. Squires ran with cloaks and wine cups and 1,000 small urgencies. Cooks shouted at pages to get out of their way and then thrust platters into their hands. Lordly voices rose and fell like these were their own kitchens and had always been. Winterfell, patient as stone and wood are patient, made room. The first feast went on until sound itself seemed to have weight. Men ate like they needed proof they were alive, and the boar that had met its death that morning died again on the platters 100 small deaths and gave no complaint. The king drank deeply and then drank deeper still, and when Cersei's mouth tightened the width of a thread, he did not choose to see it. He requested a song that no one knew and then began to sing it himself in a voice that had once been good and had long since given itself away to laughter and shouting. Ned let the sound wash over him and looked for a moment at the rafters as if he were counting them. When Robert leaned over to pound his back and call him names no one else called him, he accepted it with a tilt of his body and the faintest narrowing of his eyes that no one not looking for it would have noticed. Jon spent the feast doing the 1,000 things boys like him did during feasts. Carrying and fetching and standing where he would not be seen and being exactly where someone would turn and find him when they needed a knife exchanged or a cup replaced. He watched between these tasks. Watching was its own work, he had learned, and demanded the same patience. He saw Sansa's face caught between awe and calculation, wanting to hold the knight in both hands and not spill any of it. He saw Arya each time before Septa Mordain did and made small gestures across the space when he could. A raised eyebrow, a mouth that suggested, just a little later. He watched the king look at his father and, for a breath, be a man who had not had a crown laid on him by other men. He watched the queen watch the room with an attention that had learned long ago to hide itself in grace. He saw Jaime Lannister lean back in his chair and study a torch flame as if considering how easily he could cut it in two. He saw Tyrion Lannister lift his cup and salute no one in particular, and then, when no one looked to be injured by it, salute himself. Benjen came late to the high table, cloak wet from the melted snow on his shoulders, and took the place that had been left for him with the absent ease of a man who had never had to make room. Rooms made room for him. When he did not eat, he leaned CK to tell his brother some detail of travel or a name from some small garrison that a lord might want to affect interest in. Ned listened with that particular attention he reserved for family, closer than courtesy, farther than confession. From time to time the king would burst into their talk to demand of Benjen why he had wasted his life among men who had given theirs away, and then he would throw an arm around the man in black and call him a frozen saint and then be distracted by a new dish or a new story. The Black brothers behind Benjen ate with heads slightly bent, as if they belonged to a different sky even indoors, and took their ale as if they were surprised to find it good. toward the end of the feast, when the light had grown long and thick and the hall breathed wine, Tyrion slid from his bench and moved through the crowd like water in a rill that knows where it is going. He paused below the dais and bobbed a bow that was almost a curtsy to the queen and then went on, a smile playing with his mouth like a cat with string. He passed Jon and did not stop until he had reached the side door that gave on to the yard. Jon's feet took him there without a thought being called to tell them what to do. The cold outside was honest and came as a relief. The night had made a clean sky and thrown a handful of stars over it, careless and exact at once. Tyrion had found a place along the darker stretch of the wall, where torchlight failed and the moon had taken what work it wanted. He stood on the lower step of the staircase built for access and regarded the iron rings fixed into the stone for tethering horses as if they held some private joke. "You have the look of a boy who learned 2 names in 1 morning," he said without turning his head. Jon stopped with his hand on Ghost's ruff and the wolf's breath fogging and breaking on the air between them. He was surprised enough to answer, "Do I?" "You do." Tyrion glanced over, his eyes shrewd and melancholy in the same instant. "But all boys who think too much wear one mask or another. Consider it a game I play with myself to pass the hours between cups." He made a small courtly gesture, a bow that managed to contain no mockery. Tyrion of House Lannister, 3rd or 4th in a number of things, but first in most rooms at noticing who is trying not to be noticed. "Jon," he said, because everything beyond that snagged on the bone of itself. "Of Winterfell." "Of," Tyrion said with a small twist to the word, as if it had a thorn in it that was pleasing to the tongue. He looked at Ghost fully then and, because he was not a fool, did not reach out. "I had heard the stories. I assumed they were stories." "They are," Jon said. "Most of them." The dwarf's laugh came from someplace lower than his chest. "Most things are, at that scale." He took a careful sip of the cold. "I once slept under a Dothraki horse blanket for a month and learned more than I would ever need to know about smells and pride. The truth is always a little less well-dressed than rumor." He tilted his head. "Do you mean to go north with your uncle when our king finishes his feasting and our queen finishes her seeing, and they go south to count their enemies?" Jon tightened his hand in Ghost's coat and was punished by the reminder that you could not tighten a fist in fur. He forced his fingers to ease and found the words he had been trying on in his head, as if they were a cloak that would hide what the boy beneath was made of. "I had thought to take the black," he said. "I had thought that before the South arrived at our door. I still think it." "And what does your lord think?" Tyrion asked, as if this were a chessboard and he was counting the squares. Jon considered the freezing night. Ghost's ears twitched and stilled. "He is considering it," he said at last, which was both true and useful. Tyrion's gaze went to the dark beyond the yard, where the outlines of roofs crouched like animals trying not to be noticed by bigger animals. "Consider the thing you choose twice for its weight and not at all for its shine. That's advice I give for free because I am fond of it and because most boys cannot hear the difference. I gather you are not most boys. What makes you gather that?" Jon asked before he remembered to be cautious of what people like to gather. "The way you are holding yourself still," Tyrion said, and did not smile exactly. "Stillness is a talent. Men rarely respect it." He lifted a hand as if to make a point he had not made yet and then dropped it. "A final free counsel, for what it's worth. If you must be one thing that others name, you need not be only that thing. The wall will accept you as a hand. It does not ask you to leave your mind at home." He nodded at Ghost as if including him in the conversation and returned to the warmth of the hall without looking back. Jon stood under the gatehouse a while longer, letting the cold press against his face until sensation made its small, delicate protests. He could feel the pull of the lights behind him and the pull of the dark beyond the walls, and between them the pull of the secret his father had given him, and beneath them all the steady tug of Ghost's quiet presence. The wolf shifted nearer until their bodies took each other's heat, and Jon let himself lean into that accord just enough to remember that he was not air. Inside, a song had gone high and a drum low, and a voice he knew only in sleep had become someone else's. He slid back into the hung warmth and the flood of talk without being noticed because he had learned how to do that. Ned's eyes flicked to him once and then away, the way a man looks for the position of a familiar tower in fog. Catelyn's mouth did not thin at the sight of him because she did not allow herself the luxury of such small honesty under a queen's gaze. Arya caught him watching her and made a face that became demure just before Septa Mordane saw it. Sansa had managed to sit so near the royal children that a stranger might have assumed it had been intended from the beginning. She turned her face to Joffrey the way a flower turns to light, and when Joffrey's mouth bent, half gracious, half knowing, she glowed as if the bending were a benediction. Later, how much later Jon could not have said if someone had set a sword to his throat. Benjen slid onto the bench beside him where the lesser wine was, and the roast had cooled so that its fat behaved differently. "Your eyes are full of iron," his uncle said under the sound of the hall. "Did you think a crown would look different?" "I thought it would feel different to stand near it," Jon returned. "It feels like anything else you stand too close to, hotter than it is," Benjen said. "And it leaves a smell in your clothes that lasts." He ate with the quick, efficient bites of a man trained to regard food not as art but as fuel, and set his cup down with precise care. "You still mean it, then?" "I do." Jon had never yet had to pull a decision like a stubborn nail, but he felt the tug now and let it be felt. "I do." Benjen's mouth moved, almost a smile, because there was nothing to smile at, and Scots of old Nan's stories might have said he approved because he made a sound too small to be a word. "We'll talk to your father when the hall is quiet and the day has put away its guests." He did not ask what else was in Jon's eyes. He had the grace to pretend he did not see it. When the king's laughter had dulled and sharpened and dulled again, Ned escorted him from the hall, and Catelyn followed with her candle like a star that had agreed to be small. The queen went with a little court of silk and scent and looks that pinched each other's arms without touching. The Lannister men had their own gravity and their own company and peeled away in pairs and threes, the hound moving always as if he had found his own weather and was keeping it. Tyrion was nowhere to be seen, which meant he was somewhere useful. Robb was drawn into a men-at-arms story, his face alight. Theon sat with one boot up on the bench and made a betting man of a groom with 2 wrong guesses and 1 right. Sansa's cheek had learned the flush that girls' cheeks learn in the presence of boys who have learned to be pleased with themselves. Arya had been swallowed by the night and the Septa's long-suffering sigh. The king was not yet done with the night. The next thing Jon knew, not knew but learned by the stir itself, was that Robert had insisted on seeing the crypts, and that Ned had hesitated and then consented, which is how those two had done most things in their lives together if the stories were to be trusted. It seemed impossible to Jon, then, that he would not follow. It seemed doubly impossible that he could tell himself not to and be obeyed by himself. Ghost slid with him, a white rumor at his boots. He kept to the shadows along the left-hand wall, moving as the men whose business it was to be seen moved across the center of the yard with torches that managed to look both merry and grave at once. The air they pulled down with them to the first step had the smell of old earth and a thin metal that lived in the nostrils even after it was gone. The king spoke loudly as if to keep the dark itself from answering. "Do you remember?" Robert began, and then did not finish because remembering came hard-wrapped and some part of him did not want Ned to do it with him. "I remember," Ned said, and then for a long while they said nothing in the way men say nothing who have said too much together already. Jon kept a soberness in his feet and an eye for the niches a boy could inhabit and go unnoticed. The crypts were shaped to hold grief in a civil manner. Stone had been taught to put human faces on its own patience and to pretend these faces watched with intelligence. The torches wobbled their light over them now, making shadows get up and sit down again in the eye hollows. At Lyanna's statue, the king's breath changed. It grew not louder exactly, but less steady. His big hand reached for the carved roses and then stopped short. His fingers stood a moment in the cold air as if unsure they were invited. In the end, he did not touch. "There she is," he said, and his voice was a thing picked out of his throat like a fishbone. "There she is. All these years and I come back to her made of rock. There's wit in it." He did not laugh. "Aye, there's wit." Ned held the torch so that the light lay across the carved face and smoothed away some of the chisel's lines. "She would have told you not to be foolish," he said, and Jon felt the words like a hand in his back. "She told me many things." Robert said, and scraped a sound like a laugh out of the deepest part of him, and did as she pleased with me as with all of us. His eyes on the stone were no king's eyes. They were a boy's that had had a crown slammed down on them. Do you ever dream of her? Sometimes, Ned said, when the weather turns. I dream she laughs, Robert said slowly. I dream she runs. I never dream she is still. He looked down then, a long stare into the dark between his boots, as if the stone would permit him to see his feet in some older time. And then I dream of that silver-haired bastard who carried her off. I dream his music, gods forgive me. And then I dream his skull, and I remember that I crushed it into splinters, and then I forget his music. The words came like a man chopping wood. There, that is how I keep warm. Ghost's flank pressed into John's calf. He barely felt it through the fire running cold through him. He made himself breathe because to stop would be to make a sound. He thought for a moment he had imagined the king's next words because something in him refused them even as they arrived. If his get had lived, Robert began and stopped, and everyone breathing in the crypt held the breath politely. It doesn't matter. The gods were kind enough in that at least. I will keep mercy I find. He straightened his shoulders, a habit that had once been a flex and now was a thought the body performed by memory. I plan better feasts than prayers, Ned. Enough of this. Come, old friend. I'll drink a cask in her name and she will scold me for it as a sister scolds. It will serve. Ned blew the torch a little and the flame leaned toward the stone and then away as if refusing to kiss it. As you like. They turned. John flattened himself in the dark and Ghost went still to his very skin. The flare of the torches on the way back up lit the curve of stone to Ned's mouth and the exhaustion laid in it, and the king's profile cut against that light with its strength and its ruin. When the sound of their going had revealed itself small, John moved again, feeling made of bark and the inside of bark both. He let Ghost lead him up by the slower stair, where the draft smelled of damp and iron and something else that might have been years. Back among light and noise, he held himself the way he had been taught to. Still and useful, shoulders square, mouth even. Every time someone passed near with their own smell of smoke and salt meat. His heart remembered what it had heard below and tried to grow larger than his chest. He kept it where it was with both hands and called it by its old name. He had worn that name too long to lose it in a night. He could not lose it without becoming something he had no place to be. Sleep did not want him that night. When it came, it did not properly belong to him. It belonged to an older boy or maybe to a man. He found himself standing knee-deep in snow under a sky so bright with stars that it felt as if you might reach up and knock one loose. He was not cold. His breath did not steam. The wall rose in front of him, a long white bone laid down at the edge of the world. When he put his hand to it, the ice hummed, a music so low he could feel it in his ribs. When he pressed his ear to it, he thought he heard something living on the other side of the world's fur. No words, no shape, only a pulse older than the oldest thing in him. Ghost stood beside him in the dream and did not vary in size no matter how near or far John looked. When he woke, the place where the wolf lay against his shins was warm and real and anchoring, and he lay quiet and let that be enough. The next day the yard sorted itself into its new order, which is what yards do when strangers are added to their mathematics. There were extra grooms and stable boys everywhere and extra horses to step down the same rival's distance between rails. The king's men drilled in white and gold where Winterfell had always drilled in gray. The sound of new iron sang briefly above the old and then sank into it, and soon you could not have said where one ended and the other began. Men found ways to be in each other's way that did not involve swords, and boys watched the older boys from the safe vantage of doors and shadows. Joffrey came with 2 lads who were paid to be his friends and a dog of a man who was paid to be his mouth when threats were cheap, and stood along the fence as Ser Roderick set the men to their work. The prince did not lean so much as arrange his weight against the rail in a way that suggested that what he leaned on belonged to him. His hair caught the weak sunlight and played with it. He smiled when one of the guardsmen missed a beat in his blade's path and looked toward the hound as if to share the sight. But Sandor Clegane had found something far across the yard to look at and did not move his eyes. Jaime Lannister appeared after a time, trimming one leather glove with the scabbard of his thumb, and watched with a face that did not so much seem bored as simply complete. When he turned his head, the hall's light lay in his hair, as if it had been put there by a careful hand. Robb's blood liked a crowd, and today it liked it twice as much. He threw himself at Grayling, an older man with a good right arm, with his own body's particular charm. He fought like what he was, young, healthy, full of belief. Theon cheered like a fool, and among his nonsense were one or two pieces of advice any sergeant would have given with pride. Jon took the far end of the line with the men who had learned not to need being seen. Ghost lay under the rack that held the blunted irons and did not so much as flatten an ear when a shield landed too close to his nose. Jon kept his wrist easy, his hips under him, and his eyes where they needed to be. If Joffrey looked his way, Jon did not let the looking catch. There is a talent to being unnoticed by the people who want to notice the room. He had learned it with his skin. Benjen came to the edge of the yard with something of his own arithmetic in his hands and set his feet just so. A man who had watched too many boys turn their ankles on stone and did not care to watch another. His gaze fell across Jon and paused, amused and approving without bothering to separate the two. "Lordling," Theon called out in a cheerful blasphemy to Joffrey after a particularly noisy exchange, and when the hound's head came around slow as winter, Theon added brightly, "With respect, mind your tongue," Robb said under his breath, too amused to be truly rebuking. But Theon's grin only widened in his easy way, as if his mouth had never learned to stop when his sense told it to. Joffrey's glance slid to Jon then and held for a fraction. It was not a look of hatred, nor of kindness, nor of anything so easily put in a word. It was the look of a boy who found something unexpected where he had not thought to look and was deciding whether to want it. Jon held that look as he would hold a fence rail when a horse brushed too close, firmly, without invitation. Joffrey's mouth made a small shape and then smoothed. He said nothing. He did not need to. The boys beside him received his meanings like birds receiving seeds. Ser Roderick's voice cut the air and the practice changed shape. Shields up, shields down, pairs into quarters, quarters into a clumsy line that had pretensions of being a wall. Jaime Lannister said something so quiet that only the Hound could have heard it and smiled to himself when the Hound did not answer. It might have been his own joke. He might have been the only man there who got it. When the lesson broke and the men went to water and to strip off the iron, Jon crouched for Ghost and the wolf floated up under his hand as if he had been waiting for that signal and no other. Joffrey sauntered a step or two toward them and then away again as if he had never moved in either direction. His friends copied him and were worse at it in the way boys are always worse at being other boys. The Hound's hand went to the dog the prince did not own and scratched in the air, absent, feeling for a bristle that would not be raised. He spared Jon a look from half his face, the ruined side, as if there were something in spectacles that kept a man honest when you saw him from that angle. "Your creature is a pretty thing," he said. It was not quite an insult and not quite approval. "He is not a creature," Jon said, because something in him would not let that word pass. "He is Ghost." The Hound's mouth moved. "That he is." The conversation died in a civil way. Joffrey had long since lost interest, which is how some boys hold their power as long as they do, by not staying anywhere long enough to be seen too clearly. He had turned his attention to Robb and was asking questions with more suggestion in them than inquiry, the kind that are more fun to answer than to ignore. Robb's answers were light as ever and just careful enough. The dance suited them both for now. That afternoon, when the yard had tired itself out of the royal novelty and the kitchens were banging out their own next wonders, Catelyn sent for Jon. He did not go often to rooms where Lady Stark's quiet ruled. It would have been easy to claim work or to say he had not gotten the message in time. He went because not going struck him as something a boy might do after learning what he had learned, and he had decided when he woke that morning not to be led by tonight's fear when today had business. The solar was warmer than the hall by 3 degrees and smelled of thyme and beeswax and, faintly, wool singed when a candle had mischief in it. Catelyn sat with a basket of mending in her lap because even a lady's hands need work to keep them steady. The Queen's ladies had left behind a drift of chatter as thin as the threads Catelyn drew through a sleeve. She looked up when he entered, and for one moment he thought something had eased in her face. If it had, it was gone when her eyes settled on him. "You sent for me, my lady," he said, and found that his mouth could do courtesy even when his belly had other plans. She studied him as if she had found a stain on the floor that would not come up and was determined to work at it anyway. "Your uncle says you mean to take the black," she said at last. Jon's heartbeat made a sound in his ears like small drums. "I have thought of it," he said. He was not sure what he would be, telling her yes. "You have thought of it?" she repeated, soft and bad-tempered at once. "You have lived on my stone, and now you will go and live on another woman's colder stone. Perhaps stones are what suit you." When he did not answer, because there was no answer that would please, and he had resolved, at the least, not to make anything worse, she went on in the tone she reserved for things that had wronged her and would not apologize. "It might be for the best," she said, "for all of us. It is not a place for a boy, but perhaps you are not a boy. It is not a place for a son, but—" She broke off there and stabbed her needle through the sleeve with enough force that any cloth but the humble one under her hand might have torn. "You will speak to your father," she said, as if the matter were settled, which perhaps it was in the only sense that mattered, her sense. "I will," Jon said. He bowed because it cost him nothing and might save him something later. When he left, he felt the warmth of the room on his shoulders like the briefest of hands, and then the cold slope of the corridor, where voices went tall and thin and lost themselves, took him. Ned did not send for him that night. The king sent for Ned. He did it at the head of 12 men and 24 appetites and spoke where anyone could hear him, because he was king and could not afford to be patient or coy. If he had been the man he had once been, he might have come alone, and the thing would have been different. He was not, and it was not. Jon sat with Robb and Theon near the lower fire in the great hall and let their talk flow past him. Robb was relishing the day as if it had been cooked for him. Theon was promising things to girls he had not yet met. Arya had stolen Bran's last bit of sweet and ran, and Bran took 2 steps and stopped because somewhere he had been told to do exactly that. Sansa sat with a piece of cloth in her lap that would be fine when it was finished and was not yet. Septa Mordain counted a string of beads and her lips moved without sound, perhaps from prayer, perhaps from annoyance. A dog farted and was embarrassed by it. When dogs are embarrassed, the whole world becomes briefly kinder. When the hall dimmed to its embers and the last songs were tired of themselves, Jon went to the yard. He went to the Godswood, because he had been taught not to avoid the place where his mind wanted to go when it was troubled. He went because his father had taught him by example what men do with the parts of themselves that do not answer to others. Ghost came silent at his heel. The heart tree stood with its ridiculous, terrible face, and he thought, as he had thought before, that if it had been carved differently it would have said something different. He sat and listened to the water say its small piece. The night said nothing, as nights do, and they already know they have your attention. Footsteps came and stopped where men stopped who respected the place. Jon did not look up. He did not need to. Ned sat beside him without a sound, as if the stone had made room and always had meant to. "You followed the king below," Ned said at last. It was not a question. "I did," Jon said. He kept his eyes on the tree because looking at the man beside him would make him a boy again, and he was not sure his chest could hold the change twice in a day. "He spoke my father's name." "Yes," Ned said, and the word was older than the man. "He spoke of killing," Jon said. "He did," Ned said. They did not speak for a time that had its own shape. Ghost's breath counted it out softly. Somewhere beyond the wall the kennels coughed up the day's dust. "I have no counsel to give you that would not be a lie," Ned said at last, with the weary dignity of men who have agreed to be poor in that coin for most of their lives. "I can give you only what I was given. Oaths and work and a roof, and what love I had to spare when I had sons and daughters whose names the world did not get to argue about. That is poor fare. It has been enough thus far." "It was more than I expected," Jon said, and meant it and was hurt by it all at once. Ned's hand found his shoulder and sat there. He did not squeeze. He had always been careful with the boy's bones. "If you choose the wall, I will send you with all the honor I can make of the thing. It is no small life. It is not nothing. Men with less blood than you have made themselves there, and some have found a peace that cities cannot afford. You will have your uncle. You will have stones that do not ask questions. Sometimes stones are better than men." He paused. "And if you choose something else, I will not let them have you. Not easily. Even a king can be made to understand some things he does not want to understand when a friend stands in his way. I have stood in his way before. I will do it until the day I cannot stand." Jon swallowed, and in the swallowing there was a little boy who wanted to put his head in a lap where he had never been invited to lay it. He sat straighter. "There is no something else," he said. That was not entirely true. There was always something else. That was life's unkindness. There is the wall. There is ghost. There is what I can make with my hands that belongs to me and not to a name. It will be enough. If it is not, it will be what I have. Ned's hand tightened once. The squeeze on the forearm men gave when they meant not for comfort but for truth. "Then that is what we will do." They sat a while longer and did not pretend they were praying. When Ned left, he left as he had come, without tugging at the night. Jon did not follow immediately. The faces carved in the smooth bark watched him and did not judge. He put his palm to the cold wood and felt nothing at first, and then, slowly, the faintest tremor, as if trees had their own heartbeats that only the patient feel. He stood until his hand had warmed a patch the size of a coin and then took it away so the tree could have its cold back. The days arranged themselves around the royal presence with the stubborn grace of Winterfell's routine. The queen took the measure of Catelyn's hospitality and found it sufficient. The king took the measure of Winterfell's ale and found it insufficient unless there were two of it. The children took the measure of one another with glances and shaped their plans upon what they liked and what they could get away with. The yards held new faces and kept their old rules. Men with more gold in their vows than honor puffed and preened. Men with less gold than scars tried to keep from being stepped on and did not always succeed. Sansa and Joffrey made a delicate show of being happy in the way right people are happy. When set to the side, Joffrey tried his bow against a target and hit it often enough to keep his own vanity from cracking, and Sansa achieved an expression that made the watching of such efforts look like a sacrament. Arya grew thorns 2 inches longer and used them for climbing. When Septa Mordane caught her, Arya's mouth became an instrument made to render the demure guilty. Tommen warmed to the kennels like bread to an oven, and the master of the hounds let him hold a pup large enough to knock him down with a sneeze. Myrcella fell in love, briefly and wholly, with a girl of 10 who could spin a hoop on one ankle and keep a song in her throat at the same time. The girl returned the affection by showing the princess where the ice melted first at the edge of the godswood in the morning, because that is what generosity looks like when you are 8 and something perfect is yours to share. Robert wanted boar. Men gave him boar. He wanted a hunt that would let him sweat in a way that meant something. He wanted to talk about old battles and new mistakes as if they were girls' names and wine types. He wanted to sit with Ned and call him Ned and remember a world that had not yet been taxed by crowns. He did most of these things, and when he could not, he shouted at people who could not understand him loudly enough that he felt understood. Cersei wanted something men suspect queens always want and are often wrong about. She wanted to reduce a new place to familiar parts and lay them out under her hand like knives, so that when she reached she could find one in the night just by the touch of the hilt. She made allies where she could and complaisance where allies were impossible. Catelyn showed her everything that could be shown and none of what was not hers to show. Tyrion wanted the wall. It became the punchline to a small joke he told himself at breakfast and the premise for a larger one he told himself at dinner. He arranged to see it as one arranges to see a painting mentioned too often by people whose taste one does not necessarily respect. He told Jon as much in the yard where the smell of singed hair and sweat lay low to the ground, and he added, "We will see it together, perhaps. I have never been anywhere that was exactly what men said it was." "Perhaps," Jon said, and the word gave him more room than he had had the moment before. The night before the hunt that would become a story not for what it brought down but for what it failed to do. Jon lay in his bed and felt the stones of the keep a hand's breadth beneath his palate, as if the world had taken off its glove and set it under his head. He slept and dreamed again. He was in the yard, but the yard was older and younger, seasons layered. Snow fell upward and flames bent forward but did not travel from their torches. When he looked down, he stood with one foot in frost and one in dust, and where his toes divided the world, a thin line of water ran. Ghost stood ahead and turned his head back as if to ask, "Do you come?" and started forward when John nodded. The heart tree grew through the hall where people had eaten yesterday and no one had taught it to stay in its yard. Its red leaves winged the rafters. Someone sang in a language John had never learned and did not need to, and when he turned his head to find them he woke, breathless. He lay still and listened to his own body, and then to Ghost's steady hush, and then to the faint scrape of a mouse somewhere deciding to change its mind about a route. He slept again and did not dream. When the morning itself had rinsed the sky clean and the hunt's horns were bright as knives, John found himself called to stand among the horses while men mounted. Robert sat, a great brown beast that looked equal to him in appetite and less so in sense. The king pounded its neck, and it took the pounding like a dog who loved too much. The queen's mount was a pale dapple that made a game of looking delicate. The hound took a horse that would not carry another man without trouble, and the horse did not trouble him. Jaime Lannister's stallion moved like a ripple under silk. Ned looked his usual self in the saddle. Plain, correct, all of his weight where it would do the horse the least harm. "Where do you put that wolf when he is not at your heels?" asked Tyrion, passing close enough to be smelled of some southern herb John could not name. "He puts himself," John said, and Tyrion nodded as if this satisfied some longer theory. "Good beasts do," he said. "They save their masters from the worst parts of their masters." Then he went to seek the king and the notion of a jest. John stood with Ghost at the edge until the horns were a stitchwork of sound in the air, and the bright part of the train went with them, and most of Winterfell stood a slack minute, as if the pull of that many horses had taken breath with it. When that time ended, men went about the work of a place that now held an absence, which is its own kind of presence. The kitchens changed what they had meant to make for supper. The grooms eyed stables that would be lighter for a day and did not trust the emptiness. Catelyn's orders found their long-planned routes. The Queen's ladies practiced being seen in fewer places at once. John went to the wall the dwarfling had mentioned and looked toward where the tree line had closed behind the party. The day was tender blue and white. A raven's black stick marked it, a single note crossing a page. Ghost sat with his butt on the snow, his tail a white loop. He made no sound. John made none either. He half hoped that something would come to him there, a thought the size of a meal or the shape of a decision he had not yet decided. Instead, the cold came, which is honest, and a small ache in the shoulder he had banged 2 days ago, which is its own honesty. He breathed that in and let it out. The world did not care. This was a comfort. That afternoon he found himself in the library, a place where fire and leather and dust made a theology. He had not come looking for anything except paper. He found Maester Luwin and, near him, the smell of the oil he used to soften old bindings. The Maester looked up, the chain at his throat catching the light without requesting it. "John," he said, and he had never said the boy's name with anything but kindness. But today there was a care in it that might have been a knowledge, or only the man's profession at work. "You look as if a question had pushed you out of your own bed." "I can sit?" John asked, as if he had not moved pell-mell through this room since he was small enough to trip over a hoop they set out to keep him from reaching the interesting shelf. Luwin waved a hand that gathered everything in it that belonged to the Maester: permission, dry humor, attention, and placed it before the boy. "You can sit," he said. "You can also ask. I cannot promise anything but the pleasure of trying to answer." John sat. Ghost stretched on the flagstones and made a rug of himself. "If a man chooses a thing and then learns something that would have made him choose different if he had known it first," he said, feeling as if he were picking his way across a river on uneven stones, "does it make the first choice a lie?" Luwin blinked slowly. "Would you permit me to ask whether the man is you?" John looked at the spine of a book whose title someone had nearly rubbed off with affection. "We can pretend he's someone else," he said. He felt the older man consider that and accept it as the gift that it was. "He is a man who meant to swear a vow. He has been given new knowledge. The vow is not yet spoken. He still thinks he wants the vow. But now he knows that if he speaks it, it will mean something larger than he imagined. Luwin sat back a little. Vows always do when properly made, he said. Men who tell you different are selling you something or asking you to swear to the wrong thing. But I take your point. There is a difference between binding yourself to a thing and binding a world. Most men never have the strength to lift the ladder, even by accident. He tilted his head. Your hypothetical man is stronger than he thought he was. Then, Jon almost smiled. That is one way of putting it, he said. Luwin's hands, ordinary hands, moved over to the jar that held goose quills and selected one without looking. Habit doing what choice would have done with more time. He turned it between his fingers. If I were a storyteller, an honest one, I would tell you that the man's first choice is both true and not true, as most good choices are. He chose the oath for reasons that were sufficient then. If he speaks it now, he will load it with more, and it will answer him back more loudly. The oath is still an oath. Its letters have not changed. What changes is the man speaking them. It is a poor oath that cannot bear being spoken by a better informed mouth. He set the quill down. Our business, when we can, is to make ourselves the sort of mouths that deserve good words. Jon took that in. It was not comfort, not exactly. It was food that would last. Thank you, he said. Thank me when you are an old man and have not broken your back under the things you load on it in youth, Luwin said, and smiled to take the sting out of the sentence. Not all of it. And Jon, if you cannot tell me a thing, do not tell me. Secrets are not chickens. They do not fatten with a few more crumbs. But imagine that I have put a hand between your shoulder blades. That is what I can do for you. It is not much. It is also not nothing. I feel it, Jon said, and he did. The hunt did not go badly. It did not go well. It went as hunts go when they mean to distract a king from the weight of the things he carries and find themselves instead reminding a man of what weight is. Men came back sweaty and red and with laughter that did not go deep. Robert was pleased with everything outside himself and drank to drown the part that was not pleased. The queen's mouth could have cut bread. Ned looked the way he had looked since the king's arrival. A man reading a long letter and finding a mistake on the last page and the first. No one spoke yet of going south or of staying north in a way that would stick. They were all still learning the shape of the choice. That night Jon stood on the inner wall where Tyrion had stood and looked beyond Winterfell to a world the moon showed him in silver. He felt less one boy than 3 or 4 boys stacked within one another like the toys merchants brought north at fair time. The outermost plain and sturdy, the innermost carved with a care you might not expect for something so small. He thought of a prince's name and a sister's, of a mother who had been a story his whole life and had today become a statue, if a statue can ever become anything. He thought of iron beneath snow and fire beneath stone. He thought of ghost, warm against his calf, and to choose the wall because it gave him back himself when everything else wanted a piece. He thought of the king who would sit in his father's hall and who would take his father away and call it a favor done to them both. He stayed there until the cold asked for more respect than he had planned to give it, and then he went in and supped with men who would forget his face 3 months hence and still have the muscle memory to move aside for him in a narrow passage because bodies remember kindness longer than brains do. Robb flung a boiled turnip at Theon and missed. Theon made a theater of dodging that would have been less entertaining if the turnip had not landed exactly where the man had been. Arya stole a spoon without a plan and found herself forced to improvise a crime that would justify it. Sansa told a lady she thought much of the South, without being allowed to say how much or whether much meant many or often. Catelyn was everywhere her husband was not and filled all the spaces he left as if she had been trained as mortar. When Jon finally lay down that night, it was the good lying down of a body that has done its own work and not someone else's. He had time to think one useless thought about dragons, how people used that word to mean more than it meant and less than, and then whatever mind he had been about fell away. He slept like a boy whose day had been earned. The morning after, news came like a cartwheel. Heavy, almost comic in its inevitability, and louder than it needed to be. The king would ask Ned for more than bread and old laughter. He would ask him to wear a thing on his chest that the hall had not seen there. He would give him a list of enemies that would fit into a pocket and a list of friends that would take a saddlebag. He would call it honor, and he would not be wrong. He would call it necessity, and he would not be wrong. Men brought the rumor to the yard and the kitchens and the inner passage where the draft always found bare ankles, and by the time it reached John it had put on and taken off 3 hats. He saw the asking with his own eyes a few hours later, which he had not expected to do. He was carrying a message that had asked to be carried by him, perhaps because he was often politely in the right place or because someone had smiled at him who did not know better. He came round the turn of the passage to the solar and found Robert and Ned standing too far apart for comfort and too near for courtesy. The fire in the hearth had burned down to the kind of coals that don't give up when you leave them alone, and the window's thin light lay across the table like a runner no one had chosen for the room. "Since before I married or you," Robert was saying, his accent in that moment more storm country than south. "You know me. Who else do I know?" He spread his hands. They were large hands. He did not know what to do with them when he was pleading. Ned lifted his chin, and the look that passed between the 2 men might have been the passing of a blade. "You know what you ask," he said. "You know what it costs. Maybe you do not know what it will cost me. Maybe you do not care."
Robert soit l'audace.
Eat that did not come from the hearth. "I care because I am selfish enough to want you beside me," he said, and the truth of it landed like meat on a plate. "Because I am tired of being surrounded by men who nod when I say I want the moon and then charge me twice when they sell me a pretty lantern. Because I hear footsteps when I sleep and I want the ones I know to step over me." John stood with the message in his hand and suddenly needed a third. He would have gone if going would not have made a sound. He did what boys do when men speak truths too loud for the room. He became furniture. He held his breath. He let the secret that made his bones feel at once holy and guilty settle in his belly like a stone. Ned pressed his hand to the table where the light lay and left no print. "If I go south," he said, "the north empties itself of some of its weather. I have sons." He could not say "and a son, a different kind of son." John watched the words he did not say hover and die. "I have a wife who holds my house with more steadiness than I am sometimes allowed. I have a brother at the wall who is not old but is not young, and I would have my eyes a while longer on what comes out of those woods. I have work." Robert laughed once without pleasure. "Work? You count wood and pigs, and you bury men with their names on their stones like civilized folk. I need you to count snakes." He took a step. "I need you to tell me what not to drink and with whom not to smile, and to put a hand on my shoulder when I forget what it is to feel the weight of one." He swallowed. "I need you not to leave me with my enemies and my friends who wait like enemies and my family, which is worse than either and better than both." Ned stared at the coals as if they would tell him something different if he stared long enough. "Give me time," he said. "Let me look my house in the face and say the words it needs. Let me think, if you can." Robert nodded, not graciously, but he nodded. He was not a man practiced in the art of not taking what he wanted. He had learned it only where Ned made him. "I can put the wagon in the yard," he said, "and make you listen to how the wheel squeals. I can also wait while you go fetch the oil." They stood another heartbeat and then another, and in the third one Ned's head turned and his eyes found John without meaning to. They did not widen. They did not change. That was his father's particular gift. To see a boy in a doorway and not make of him anything that would be dangerous to either of them. "John," he said, "have you come to deliver or to collect?" John found his tongue, which had been hiding behind his fear. "Both, my lord," he said, and stepped forward with the folded scrap and then stepped back with a word in a different hand to carry on. He did not remember later what it said. He remembered the way the king's smell filled the room and the way his father's mouth made a line that had resisted everything that had ever tried to make it into some other shape. Outside in the corridor, the air had the taste of iron it always had near the inner ring where the old walls remembered older blades. He leaned a breath's worth against the stone and then took it back and gave it to Ghost, who had come from nowhere and was there at his knee and looked at him as if there had been no question at all about whether he would find him. John thought about choosing and about learning. He thought about leaving and staying. He thought about what it meant to be the son of a man who could be begged by a king and say not yet. He took the message where it had been asked to go and did not think ahead of the next step because that way lies stumbling. By evening, Winterfell had learned the rumor properly. The king would make Lord Stark the right hand he gave to the realm and the right hand he showed to his enemies. The queen's ladies had learned to pronounce hand with exactly the right pride and skepticism in it at once. The servants had learned to measure the salt with care they had not needed yesterday because the queen liked a different lick of it. The yard had learned to drill as if someone were watching who could tell the difference between a slouch and a step. The gods would learn nothing, which was its great strength. That night Jon stood again beneath the boughs. He did that more often now, not from superstition but because there are some rooms in a castle that have air that is good for deciding in. Benjen found him there by the oldest trick in the world, by knowing the boy and the shape of his trouble, without having to know what the trouble was exactly. "Your father goes south," Benjen said, and sat without asking, which among men is one way of asking. "It seems so," Jon said. "You knew he would," Benjen said. "You know him. You didn't want him to." Jon swallowed and found honest words. "I wanted him to choose what let me stay the same," he said. "And if there was shame in that, there was less than there might have been." Benjen's breath smoked, and the smoke drifted up to get lost among leaves that would not remember it. "We rarely get that. What we get instead is the work of being different and still being ourselves. The wall is good work for that. There is much that will ask you to hack bits off to fit. The wall asks you to grow into your own shape. Can be a cruel way to grow. But there are worse ways." Jon breathed. "When?" he asked. "When the king has had his way a little, and the queen has had hers, and your father has had the talks he can stand and the ones he owes," Benjen said. "When men have had time to get used to the idea that you can want something different than they want for you and live. I would have you as soon as I can. But you are not going to a camp. You are going to a vow. Make your bed tidy before you leave it, boy." Jon nodded. He felt, for the first time in days, a small place inside him make a neat sound like a knot pulled tight. He slept for 3 hours and woke for 1 and list. E'en to the keep think. Stone has thoughts when men stop speaking. Keeps its own counsel and only sometimes shares. He did not learn anything from it that he could repeat. He learned that he was not alone in the night. The morning of the 3rd day since the king's arrival. Frost was as bright as coin on the stable roof and smoke rose from the kitchen with the purpose that follows a plan. Jon walked the east walk with Arya, whose feet had learned to scuff and skip and suddenly be quiet in a way that made women look up, suddenly suspicious. She talked as if she had 40 words and had been promised the day would end before she spent them all. He let her spend. She told him Sansa had sworn she had heard the queen say the word betrothal, and that the word had set Septa Mordane aflutter like a hen, and that nothing delighted Arya as much as the idea of the septa flapping, except perhaps the idea of Sansa caught in a long court silk that had too many buttons to run in. "You could trip her," Arya suggested, wickedly pleased with herself. "I would never trip Sansa," Jon said. He kept a straight face for 4 steps and then smiled. "Unless she looked very proud, and then only if she wore her hair in that way that makes it stick to her lip gloss." Arya laughed so loudly she covered her mouth with both hands and bent as if the laugh were heavy. Ghost looked up at her as if he had never seen anything so odd and beloved, and then placed his head on her knee and permitted her to rub his ears upside down in a way he would not permit to any other creature alive. "Will you go to the wall soon?" Arya asked without warning in the way children ask questions the wind has brought them. "Not today," Jon said. "And after today is tomorrow," she said, and made a mouth that had never learned patience. "And after that the day after. I hate the days that take the things I like away and make me count." "I know," Jon said. He meant it in more ways than he could put in a sentence without thorns. "But they also bring things you cannot guess. Sometimes they are a little kind." He looked past her shoulder and saw Sansa crossing the yard with her head held as if something balanced there and must not be allowed to fall. Joffrey was not at her side, but his absence hung like a flag. Ned stood in the doorway with Benjen beside him, counting something that was not men or stores or time. The queen moved like a swan through trifles and left order behind her. Jaime found places to lean that made other men look untidy by comparison. Tyrion grew amused with the dogs and then bored with them and took to using Ghost as a measure of all the northern oddness that pleased him. "A wolf that does not bark," he said to Jon as if to a riddle. A boy who knows what to do with silence. He did not trouble to make a moral of it. He did not need to. On the 5th day since the king's arrival, the first cracks appeared that would not have drawn blood by themselves but would matter later when the knife found them. Jory Castle turned a Lannister man toward the right passage with the gentleness of a man who has learned a dozen ways to ask politely and deploys them before the 13th. The man took offense on behalf of a badge he would never otherwise have noticed and made a noise about insult and right-of-way. The hound's laugh cut across the yard like a rusty hinge opening. Jaime's gaze landed on the little scene and did not move. Ned came not at all. The Queen's eyes brushed the moment and were gone. Jon watched men watch each other's hands and thought how often hands are where the truth is, not in mouths. Ghost rose and stood at his side and looked where Jon looked. The wolf's ears were pricked, his weight forward. He made no sound. The Lannister man remembered then that he was paid to be loyal to a lion and not to his own temper. He remembered himself and took 3 steps back and turned. Jory nodded as if he had been thanked. Jaime offered Jon the barest incline of his head, which could have meant anything and therefore meant nothing. The moment closed. The yard went on being a yard. In the evening, Ned came and stood in the doorway of the chamber where Jon slept and where Robb and Theon were arguing over the way a thong should be tied to hold better. He did not speak until the other boys had gone with the sense to go that comes to men who have been allowed to see their lord anxious only once or twice and who know the value of not being the 3rd time. Jon looked up and felt a premonitory tightness in his ribs that was not fear and not joy and might have been an odd cousin to both. "Walk with me," Ned said, and they went to the inner wall where the wind was never too strong to prevent talk and never so still that the words could be overheard. "I will go south," Ned said without preface. "The king is my friend. I owe him that, and the realm deserves one man in that city who can look at it and not see a purse. I will go. I will take your sisters. I will leave your brothers with their mother. That is the best division I can make of my heart. Agree with me or not, that is what I will do." Jon had known it. Knowledge, when it settled into fact, still hurt. "I will go to the wall," he said. "With my uncle, if you will allow it." Ned looked at the dark as if it were a map and he needed to get his bearings. "I will allow it," he said. "I will make it honorable. I will give you all I can set in your hand to take with you that will let you be the man I believe you are. I will do all this and more." He paused. "Do not die. That is my command. Do not die for any man's pride or any man's scheme. If you fall, it will be to something you could not help, and not to something you volunteered for because a speech made you feel tall." "I won't," Jon said, and the promise went down like an iron nail driven into green wood. Solid now, suspect later, binding still. "I will write, if I can, if the ravens fly." Ned's mouth moved as if shaping a pra. He could not remember. "Right," he said. "Tell me what the cold is like at the end of the world. Tell me if men see the same stars there." He turned his head then and looked at Jon, and it was a look grown men who had known him since they were boys had never had. It made Jon feel old and not old. "I will tell you things when the time comes," he said, and the blue light took the words away from his mouth, lying that they were less heavy than they were. "Not now, not here, but I will not leave this world with you in doubt about yourself. I owe Lyanna that. I owe you. I will not run from that debt because a king whistles." Jon felt the world under his feet a little more. "Thank you," he said. "It was not enough. There is no enough for such things. I will wait." "You have?" Ned said. A small smile then. A crack that a child can put a finger into and be warmed. "You have waited all your life. You will wait a little longer and then you will not have to." He put his hand on Jon's shoulder and squeezed once, as men in the north have learned to talk when there is more to say than would be safe in words. They parted on that and slept under the same roof, not as father and son, but as something that might have been better for the night and worse for the next day. Dawn came with its usual insolence. Crows counted themselves on the wall. A kitchen girl slipped in spilled flour and made a mess of it and laughed because no one had seen but her. Robb woke with the firmness of boys who know what their day will be and was pleased by the knowledge. Theon woke with the soft groan of a man who had drunk a little too well and made a face at the sun. Arya woke with hate for the needle she had to thread and made friends with it just long enough to win. Sansa woke with a smile that had learned in a handful of days to be careful with itself and asked for a dress that did not exist yet. The king did not wake easily. He woke like a man who had slept behind a shield and found the shield gone. He reached for more of everything. He would be given all of it until the wagon sagged. The queen woke and reached for the reins and held them in her hands without seeming to pull. Jaime woke bored and beautiful. Tyrion woke with a grin that promised himself a present and went to see how much of the North could be catalogued in one afternoon's walk. Jon woke and knew the days ahead in outline. Talk, lists, small ceremonies, and then partings. He felt the push and pull of the secret in him and held it the way one might hold the haft of an axe. Not clutching, not careless. He found Ghost and scratched him behind the ear, and the wolf sneezed and shook his head and then leaned in as if the day were cold and Jon's hands could make it warmer by wanting to. The morning passed into afternoon with the particular haste that belongs only to mornings in keeps where departure is planned. Carts found wheels that fit. Coopers guaranteed the truth of their hoops and were believed because it was easier. Women packed their husbands' better shirts and then repacked them because men pack shirts like they pack feelings. Quickly and badly. Armorers hammered straps and boys ran with lists, and Catelyn made order out of a sea that did not mind her and that therefore she trusted. Ned made time for men who came to tell him that things would go awry in his absence and men who came to promise him they would not. He stood with a solidity that made promises seem less foolish. He came to Jon after and stood him a moment with his gaze the way he always had when he needed to know how much the boy had added or taken away within since their last talk. "You will go with Benjen tomorrow," he said, voice low. The words made a shape in the air that shoulders could put themselves under. "He rides at first light if the world allows it. He has provision, but you will take more. Food, you know. The South will feed you a while and it will wrong your belly. Best to have your own sense of what bread is supposed to be. Luwin will find you books that will not make your brothers think you have become a maester. Take them anyway. If they make you laugh, good. If they make you think, better. If they do neither, burn them for warmth if you must. Do not tell him I said so." The corner of his mouth jerked. Jon heard beyond the words to the thing the words were building. A goodbye that would pretend not to be a goodbye. "Yes, my lord," he said, because he had used father less since the gods would, and because the word meant something else to his own ear now, and he was not ready to learn how to set it down differently in front of the man who had carried it for them both thus far. Ned saw that in his face. He lifted a hand and let it fall. "There is more," he said, "but not today." And again, the squeeze, and again, the look that promised a future conversation, as if a promise between men could make the weather behave. That night Jon went to the kennels as if he had always planned to and had only now found the time. The hounds leaned in their straw, stinking gloriously of the life that delighted them. Tongues lolling in dreams no man could see. Ghost sniffed and turned his head from a smell that had too much vinegar to it and chose a place to lie where the straw was clean and the wood behind it held the last of the day's heat. The master of the hounds nodded to Jon as if he had always expected him. "He's a quiet one," the man said. "I prefer it. The loud ones think they're making a case to the gods. The gods are deaf to dogs. So are kings." Jon scratched Ghost under the chin where the fur lay smooth as river stone. "Maybe dogs don't speak to gods," he said. "Maybe they speak to what gods are meant to be, and we do not have a word in the common tongue for it." The man spat into the straw with the accuracy of someone who had been spitting and aiming most of his life. "That's too smart a sentence for a boy," he said. "All the more reason to take the black. They like smart boys there. Gives them something to carve into." When Jon went back to his pallet, he slept and dreamed not of ice or of fire but of a corridor he had walked 100 times whose stones kept rearranging themselves, the way stones do in dreams. He came to the door of his father's chamber and his hand went to the latch and would not turn it because he was a boy still and the world still had doors that belonged to someone else. He backed away until he came to the door of a place that had no door. He thought, "That is mine," and then woke with the heady certainty that sometimes follows a dream even when the dream is nonsense. He held on to the feeling because it felt like a kind of courage. Morning declared itself. Benjen's horse stamped in the yard. The men in black had a tidy readiness that men learn when their lives depend on not forgetting small things. Pins, ties, this cup and not that cup. Ned stood with his cloak lifted his shoulders, and the look on his face was the look of a man doing a thing he would have paid not to do, doing it well and without complaint. Caitlin stood beside him like a prayer set in stone. Rob's mouth worked as if it remembered words and could not decide which to say. Bran clutched at a thing he had been given yesterday and would love another week and then forget. Arya kept her face brave until she saw Jon and the bravery threatened to slip. She caught it by one corner and pinned it down at the last second. Sansa had the grace to come and the sense to keep her speech. The king had slept late and sent his brother Renly, who had humor enough and nothing like authority. The queen sent nothing, which was its own statement. Jon strapped the small pack on the back of the smaller horse that had been given him by men who cared about the truth of legs and backs more than the truth of pageant. He checked the knots because he has believed since he could first tie that knots are prayers said with hands. Ghost moved between the horses with the grave attention of a steward in a strange house. He came to Benjen and paused as if to say, "I am not your wolf. Do not mistake me," and Benjen nodded like a man graciously reminded of a rule he already knew. "I would not," he said. "Do not mistake me either." Ned came and stood before Jon and for a moment did not speak. Words looked like men on a battlefield, each jostling to be first. In the end, the simplest veterans stepped forward. "When you go as my heart goes," he said, low enough that no one else could hear under the scuffle of the yard. "You go with my name where it is useful and without it where it is not. You go with the truth of yourself unspoken for now. If ever that truth rises up before you and demands to be told, do not give it to anyone who could gain by it. Give it to the old gods and to the snow. Give it to your own hands. Do not give it to men." Jon nodded. That advice was not only for princes and not only for bastards. It was for anyone who had a self and wanted to keep it. He did not trust his mouth. He reached and his hand found his father's wrist, and they both made the hold that men make when they intend, for honoring. "Tell him," Jon heard himself say, surprising himself and maybe surprising his father, "when it is time, tell me." He did not say what. He did not have to. Some words are not doors. They are roads. "When it is time," Ned said. "Not before, not after." The line of his mouth did not change. It did not need to. Then there were the smaller goodbye things that happen around the larger one. Rob's hard thump on his back, the kind that says, "I do not know what to say." Theon's lopsided grin that said, "You are braver than me and I will make a joke of it." Bran's arms around his waist and Arya's fierce hug around his middle, as if to remind him there had been a time when she could circle him with both hands and did not need to reach for it. Sansa's curtsy, on the edge of becoming a woman's curtsy, and the small, careful smile that had learned more than he had given it credit for. Maester Luwin pressing a cloth-wrapped bundle at his hands with the phrase, "For boredom." And Jon feeling for a moment so much love for the man that he had to turn his head, so he would not reveal himself to the yard entire. Benjen swung into his saddle and looked down at the world with the air of a man about to wrestle something heavier than iron, distance or fate, or a young man's hope. "Shall we find out whether the North still knows us?" he asked. "We shall," Jon said, his foot in the stirrup, his hand steady. Ghost sprang into motion without waiting for a command and took his place where he wanted to be. A pace off the horse's shoulder, at an angle that kept the wind in his favor and the world where he could see it and those he loved where he could touch them. The gate opened. The outer world stood where it had always stood. They rode into it, two men in black and a boy with a white wolf, and the snow under hoof and foot made the first, clean sounds of a road before it has decided to become a story.